Hi, everybody. Welcome back. In our last video, we talked about correlational research. In this video, we're going to talk about experimental research. So our correlational research, we found out that it does not tell us whether or not we are seeing a cause and effect relationship. It only tells us that there is a relationship between variables. If we want to know if there is a cause and effect relationship, we need to do an experiment. We need to do experimental research. The only way to establish that there is a cause and effect relationship between two variables is to conduct a scientific experiment. A scientific experiment has precise requirements for design and implementation, and we've talked about that through our earlier videos. We're going to take a quick look again at the scientific method, and once again, I prefer to use the 6-step representation of the scientific method, with the first part of it asking questions. What do you want to know about? Then we gather our information. We take a look at all the research that we can find that has to do with the question that we are wondering about. Then we formulate a testable hypothesis. Then we select the research method we're going to use and gather data and conduct our experiment. After our experiment has been conducted, we review and interpret the data that we've collected, and then we report our findings. Once again, our research needs to be objective, and we will talk about some issues that we can have with research in our next video. It needs to be replicable. We talked a great deal about what it means to be replicable. Once again, briefly, that means that if somebody else does my experiment in the same way, they should get very similar results to what I find. That is being replicable. And it should be falsifiable. In other words, the question I'm asking, that hypothesis, I can either support it or prove it to be wrong. I have to design my study in that way to consider those factors. Our results are either going to support an existing theory or modify a theory, or we'll be coming up with our own theory. Let's start with our hypothesis. Our hypothesis is normally formulated through observation or after reviewing previous research. We've done our legwork, we've got our question in mind. Now it's time to ask our research question in a way that makes a prediction. And we have to make sure that our prediction is falsifiable. So we're asking that question in a way that can be tested to see if it is true or not. An example is, okay, in our correlational research video, we used an example of aggression and violent video play. So if we are watching, what our correlational research had showed us was that the viewing of violent video games was related in some way to aggression. We saw that there was a positive correlation between those, that as the hours of violent video games went up, so did the incidence of aggressive behavior. This was not a causal finding because it is correlational research. Now, we wanted to get more down to the nitty-gritty of this and see, well, let's do an experiment and see if there is a cause and effect relationship between these two variables. So to form the hypothesis, we already looked at research. Now we're going to ask our question in a way that makes a prediction and is falsifiable. Our example would be, after reviewing the literature on aggression and violent video games, my hypothesis is that participants playing video games depicting violence will behave more aggressively than those who play a video game that does not depict violence. So that's my hypothesis. It's my prediction. In other words, I'm thinking that the ones who view the violent video games are going to show more aggressive behavior than those who do not. Okay, so in our experimental research, we're going to go over a few terms real quick. I'm actually just going to pop them all up there. Whoops, pop them all up there right now. So experimental research, once again, is where we manipulate one variable to look for the effect on another variable. We try to control the environment as much as we possibly can when we do an experimental research. Our experimental research is going to hopefully show us if there is a causal relationship between our two types of variables. we're going to have an independent variable and a dependent variable. We'll look at the dependent variable on a different slide. The independent variable is the variable that is manipulated. It is something that we would consider to be the cause. So in our example, it would be the violent video games, because we're saying a violent video game is what's causing the aggression. That is our hypothesis. That's what we're predicting. So the independent variable, the variable that we are manipulating or messing with, is going to be the type of video game that people play. Okay, the type of video game is our independent variable. And we're either going to have people play the violent video game or the non-violent video game. So there's two types of video games that they're going to play. And our independent variable is the type of video game. Our experimental group are the subjects who receive a special treatment. So that special treatment would be our playing the violent video game, because that's the thing that we think is going to cause the aggressive behavior. So our experimental group is going to get the treatment that we think is going to cause something. So the treatment in this case is playing the violent video game. We are also going to have another group of participants that are called our control group. The control group is going to be a very similar group, and they're going to play a very similar game that does not depict violence. So subjects who do not receive the special treatment, in other words, they're not watching the violent video game, they're just watching a regular video game that doesn't depict the violence. That is our control group. These are the two groups that we're going to compare. The control group gives us that comparison, that ability to compare our experimental group to the, whether or not the violent video game is having an impact. So if we see differences between our experimental group, the group that is playing the violent video games, and our control group that is playing games that do not depict violence, if there's a difference between these, then we're thinking that we may have a cause and effect relationship depending on the size of that difference and such. If we don't see a difference between groups, then we can pretty strongly say that the violent video games are not causing the aggressive behavior. So the control group is very important. Okay, our next slide here is going to talk about our dependent variable. Our dependent variable is the variable that is measured. It is what we are considering to be the effect. And in our example, that would be the amount of aggressive behavior. We are saying that playing the violent video game is going to cause an increased amount of aggressive behavior. So the amount of aggressive behavior is the thing that we are measuring. So dependent variable is what is measured. In this case, that's the amount of aggressive behavior. Now, what do we mean by amount of aggressive behavior? I mean, is that punching somebody? Is that kicking somebody? What does that mean? What does it mean, amount of aggressive behavior? We have to clearly define what we mean by that, because this is something we have to measure. So we have to define it clearly. We do that by using an operational definition. The operational definition is defining a variable by how it will be manipulated or measured. In this case, we're going to say that the amount of aggressive behavior will be defined as pressing of a button to administer an uncomfortable vibration to opponents. We are going to measure the duration of the button press and the frequency of the button press. So our participants in this research project are going to be playing against somebody. Their opponent is not actually real. It's just a computer. So we're not really making somebody have an uncomfortable sensation. But our participants don't know that. They are, and we'll talk about what that is later, they are blind to knowing whether or not there's a real opponent on the other side. They are led to believe that there is an opponent on the other side, and that they can administer an uncomfortable vibration, kind of like if you've ever played the Wii games, where you can heckle people. You can push a button on your Wii remote, and then it vibrates the controller in the other person's hand, something like that. And that's how it's explained to our participants. So once again, our operational definition, the thing is pressing of a button to administer an uncomfortable vibration to opponents. We are measuring the duration of the press and the frequency of the button press. So that is how we are defining the aggressive behavior. We have to be careful not to introduce confounding variables into our study. That is anything that could affect the dependent variable besides the independent variable. So is there something else in our study that's going to make people press that button more and have that aggressive behavior more that has nothing to do with the violent video game? So for example, if in one lab, the air conditioning wasn't working well, and that's where we put the people playing the violent video game. And in the other lab, another room in the lab, we have people playing the non-violent game, and they're in a nice, comfy room, really comfortable air conditioning. Maybe, and say at the end of the study, we're seeing that, it seems that the people playing the violent video game are much more aggressive. They're doing much more button pressing than the other group. Well, if the temperatures are very different in that room, maybe the people who are in the warm room are annoyed and uncomfortable, and that leads them to press that button more. That would be a confounding variable. In that case, the temperature of the rooms would be a confounding variable. We have to be really careful in experimental research to make sure that both groups have almost the exact same settings and that everything is the same between the two groups except for the variables of interest, which in this case would be the violent video game. Everything else would have to be the same. All right, so who are these people doing our study? Well, we would need to recruit for this. So what population are we interested in? Well, okay, I'm interested in college students. And one of the reasons I'm interested in that is because, well, I have access to college students. So in theory, every college student would be the population, and I would need a subset of that population. Now, if you were going to consider like every community college student, you would have to have samples from various community colleges all over your region or whatever it is you want to do. So maybe I better rein this in and say, okay, at our school, let's see, let's take a look at the students at our school and our population, our school population. So now I have to get a sample or a subset of that population. Once again, like I mentioned previously, we have to make sure that we get a subset of the population, just like when we talked about with our surveys. We have to get a representative type of sample. So I would need to get different types of college students. Like I wouldn't just go to just the psychology students and get recruitments from them, because they might have a different perspective and such than those who do not study psychology. So that could be a confounding variable in itself. I would need to go through and just draw people from all different areas of the college, all different disciplines, okay? And then I create that subset. So once I have the people here that I use, so it's like, what do they have, like 47 people here in this? So I have my group here of possible participants in my study. So all these folks have been screened and whatever, and they are considered to be appropriate subjects for this experiment. So now that I have this group, I'm going to randomly assign them into either the, let's see if I have it here. Yeah. Oh, we already talked about it. I'm going to randomly assign them into one of two groups. And let's see. Nope. Okay, I don't have the slide there for that. But so they're each person in this population down here is going to have an equal chance to either end up in the experimental group that's watching the violent video game, or the other group that is not our control group, that is watching that is playing the non-violent game. So each person has just as equal of a chance to end up in either group. That's random assignment. So I would do, and there's different ways you can do random assignment. You can talk about that in an experimental class, which is really fun. Anyway, so we get them assigned to their assigned group, and then we do our study. So what happened in that study? Actually, researchers did do that study. There have been research that research that has done that particular study. And what they found was in their laboratory setting, they found that the students that watched the violent video games did press that button more and for longer than those who did not watch the violent video game. So, in a sense, this is a cause and effect relationship. Um, we can say that in that particular setting, with college students, with that sample of college students that we had, in a laboratory setting, we saw that the way our aggressive behavior is defined, those students demonstrated more aggressive behavior. Now, because this is a laboratory experiment, so it is a cause and effect relationship. We did find a cause and effect relationship. However, how generalizable is this research? We know that this works in this laboratory setting. Will it work? Will we get the same findings in somebody's home out in the world? We are not so sure of that. So in our study, we cannot generalize too much about our results. We did find a cause and effect finding, but we know it's in this setting with this group of people. This is because the research is done in the lab with college students. Outside of this setting, we cannot be sure the results would be the same. Is our study replicable? Yes, it is. Somebody else can do that same study and they would come up with very similar findings. Is it falsifiable? Yes, there was a possibility that our control group and our experimental group would have no difference. That possibility was there. So it was falsifiable. And how does it relate to current theories? So going back to the initial theories that we might have read about viewing violent TV, viewing violent video games, this would add some support for that idea that constant exposure or that exposure to these types of violent media increases the likelihood of aggressive behavior. So it does, in a sense, support that type of theory. However, once again, it's not highly generalizable. All right. In our other study where Timmy is kicking and poking at people, we don't know that's from violent video games. We can't generalize it to Timmy over there. Remember Timmy from our observational research video. All right. We're going to go ahead and this is our last slide. We'll go ahead and cover this real quick. Threats to validity of the research. So there are all sorts of things. If you're not very careful when you design your study, there are threats to the validity of the research. First is called construct validity, and that is, does it measure what it's supposed to measure? Are we actually measuring aggression in this study? Are we measuring the correct thing? Is our tool correct that we're using? Statistical validity, do we use the correct statistical analysis for this? Were they interpreted correctly? Internal validity, changes caused by confounding variables. Were those rooms the same temperature? That's a type of thing we would be looking at. External validity. The observed effects may actually only be found under limited conditions for specific groups of people. So that goes back to that idea of generalizability. How generalizable are our findings? And then reliability. That refers to the consistency of a measured variable. Does it measure the same way every time? And in our case, our study was reliable because the way we were measuring our button presses and the duration of the button press was the same for every person in the study. It was the same every time. There was no variation in it, so it was very reliable. Okay, so that's it. Our next video, we're going to talk about ethics and some other issues with research. Okay, I appreciate your patience with me on this. I hope these videos can offer you a little bit of help. All right, if you have questions, once again, as usual, let me know and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. Thank you and have a really good day.